Oh, you're much too young. This is only your first relationship. You're not even going to remember this in a few years. These are the types of comments that teenagers are frequently met with when discussing relationship difficulties. However, if we downplay or invalidate a teenager's romantic relationship, then that could prevent them from seeking help when the relationship becomes abusive. So, how can we talk to teenagers about romantic relationships without driving them further away? And what are some signs that abuse may be occurring in teen relationships? This is Unsilenced, a JBWS podcast where we have real conversations about abuse. I'm MC Robinson, and today I'm speaking with.
Maddie Hahn, and I manage our dating abuse prevention program here at JBWS.
This episode answers so many questions about dating abuse for both teenagers and their parents or guardians. Maddie explores how abuse among young people may actually present differently than our traditional idea of domestic violence. She explains how parents or guardians can casually promote healthy relationships just by encouraging discussions about media and pop culture. And when these discussions do arise, she offers suggestions on do's and don'ts to navigate the conversation. This episode covers everything from location sharing, the expectation of constant communication, how we can model healthy relationships for teenagers ourselves, how bullies mimic dynamics of power and control we see in abuse, and the importance of maintaining our own personal relationship armor. I really loved having this conversation with Maddie, and I hope you enjoy listening. But before you do, please take a moment to subscribe to Unsilenced, wherever you get your podcasts, so we can continue to break the silence around domestic violence. It's interesting because I think a lot of times when teen dating comes up, there's this belief that abuse only happens to people once they've hit a certain age or once they're older. But can abuse happen in teen relationships or even preteen relationships?
Absolutely. And I think that's also often a misconception that a lot of people have, and even sometimes pushback I'll get when I reach out to introduce myself to new groups of people and kind of share what we do. There's sometimes this like disbelief, I would say, maybe of, oh, this isn't like a need, or this doesn't happen in my community, this doesn't happen in my school. Sometimes there's even a negative association where if I bring this kind of education and prevention, is it agreeing or sharing with other people that we are saying we have this issue? And I'm like, it's absolutely not. But also, this absolutely is happening because this happens to 1 in 3 young people. And I think a big part of that kind of myth goes into our assumptions of dating violence or domestic violence being that this is an adult issue. I think it also happens because the things that we think of, like from a perspective of not working in this kind of field, if we were to close our eyes and think about what we instantly think of domestic violence and dating abuse, I think a lot of us think of really kind of upfront egregious forms, like right in our face, like physical violence that's very hard to deny. Or a lot of people, I think of that financial control also. All of things we really associate with what we see our adult people experiencing when partners are causing harm. So it can totally happen, but I can see how from an outside perspective it can seem like, oh, maybe this isn't something that young people are experiencing. But as I just mentioned, it's 1 in 3 young people who will be impacted by dating abuse. And that's quite a large number of people.
When you're out in the community and you're talking with people, maybe you're talking with schools or parents, and they hear that statistic for the first time that 1 in 3 teens or 1 in 3 young people will experience some form of abuse before adulthood. What is their response to that? Do they find it shocking, or how do you convey the prevalence to them in a way that they'll like accept?
So I really try to talk about a lot of these different examples of dating abuse that young people are experiencing. And I feel like once I talk to people about these examples, they kind of have this aha moment. They're like, oh, like that's dating abuse. So it's not that people actually are thinking this doesn't happen. I think people are really just not realizing that these things that we're talking about and educating people on are dating abuse. So like some of those examples that I think can go a little bit more under the radar. And I don't want to ever call them like smaller because they're not small, but just a little bit more nuanced, harder to see, or maybe even fall in a gray area to some people. And depending on our perception, it may not feel or look that way, but like constant texting, tracking of partners and kind of misusing that access and information that folks have, controlling who people talk to, spreading rumors, password sharing. So even without living with a partner and experiencing domestic violence, there's a lot of emotional and verbal abuse things that can happen to young people that, again, like I said, I think can seem a little bit more under the radar. So we're not noticing these as much. And a lot of these behaviors are also extremely normalized.
I'm curious because you mentioned like the constant texting and you mentioned some things that maybe people wouldn't, to your point, immediately identify as a problem. And what are some of those issues with the texting?
So again, I think it really goes back to the normalization of this because, oh, teens and young people, they're on their phones a lot anyways. Like they're texting everyone. They want to engage in this. But at a certain point, it may be more than they want to engage in. And I also think a huge part is the young people themselves not recognizing maybe that this is kind of crossing a line for them as well. So that's like a lot of times in the classroom, we're kind of talking about boundaries and encouraging students to think about their own boundaries and kind of follow their gut reaction of, well, at first, maybe this seemed normal. I was kind of going along with it, but now I'm kind of challenging myself to think about this in a different way. And I'm like, okay, maybe I didn't like that, or maybe that didn't make me as comfortable as I assumed it was, because I think especially when young people are dating and just developing their norms of relationships, it can often be their first, second relationship. The only expectation we have really is the people in our lives and what they set as examples of relationships for us, which can often also be a lot older and more mature relationships that are setting the tone that I would personally say if two people in a committed adult relationship are sharing locations with one another and they both feel safe and comfortable and they're using it in a respectful and boundary way. I'm not going to sit here and say that that's an unhealthy thing for people to engage in. But at the level for younger people, I do think it crosses that line a lot sooner. So I think just the age and stage of the relationship for young people can kind of blur that line maybe of what we think is okay in some other relationships where power and control can leak in.
I am going to ask you to kind of clarify when you're talking about, for instance, the constant texting and the location sharing. I think like if you could just kind of explain how it could be used as a tool of manipulation.
Definitely. So I'll start with the location sharing. And we were actually talking about this at the school I was at earlier today. And I think this one can be so easily misused because we can share this information with someone with the best intentions, thinking both of us are going to use this in a safe and healthy way for one another. But then we don't know how the relationship is going to evolve, what situations we're going to be in that could, even if we never had the intention of misusing this, just having this access and the temptation to it can have us in a position where now we're using this as a power and control element. So an example, two partners shared this in the beginning of a relationship. They both felt safe and comfortable to do so. It felt like a healthy boundary between them two. They both wanted to. But now, flash forward 3 months later into the relationship, things aren't as great as they were when they first shared this information. They've maybe been getting into a few fights. Someone seems a little distant, like they're pulling back. And they noticed their partner was, when they just casually went to track their location, they noticed their partner was somewhere they didn't recognize before. And they told them that they were hanging out with their friends. And now that person's sitting there and they're like, that's definitely not the friend's house they told me they were going to be at. And the temptation then for that person to drive to that location, because it's only 5 minutes from their house. I just want to see whose house it is. Maybe it's someone else's. And then that's stalking. That's digitally stalking our partner to then show up and look. But when I say it that way, I can see the innocence almost of the thought process of where curiosity got the best of you and you had this information and you had this access and you're like, well, instead of being a crazy person and calling them 500 times and demanding they tell me where they are, I can just go find out where they are. Or I can ask, I can screenshot this, send it to a few of my friends, and I can just make sure it's not that person's house that I think they're at. And I like to give an example like that because I want to humanize it also, that sometimes we can make mistakes in relationships and not realize how, in that moment, if you're that person feeling those thoughts, you might not realize how controlling that is and how that is stalking your partner and violating their boundaries. And when you're in the moment and you're feeling that so intensely, it's harder to see that. So I think that's a good example of how you can have this information and then end up really misusing it again, even if that wasn't your intention in the beginning. But something I do like to share with people, because if you ask most young people, they are sharing their location with their friends, with their partners, with the world. They really feel very comfortable making this public access information. And I also encourage young people in the same note, if we're going to have this information and we're going to have this access, how about we also use it to respect our partner's boundaries? So maybe your partner was planning on calling you when they got home on Friday night. They usually get home around 10:30, and they were going to give you a call. You were going to just like talk for the end of the night. And you notice your partner didn't call you. So you have two options. You could sit there and you could blow them up and you could say, this isn't fair. You said you were going to call me. Like, we had this time for one another. Or maybe if you have this information, you could pop over, you could see, oh, my partner is still at their friend's house. I'm not even going to follow up. I'm just going to respect that they're at their friend's house and they're enjoying their time. And I'm sure they'll either call me later or they'll call me tomorrow and we'll check in another time. So while we can talk about all the ways we can misuse it, I also like to really empower young people that if we're going to use this kind of information, let's also use it to have some healthy boundaries and respect our partners at the same time. So instead of always looking for the red flags and unhealthy things, how can we use this commonly misused information for a really healthy, safe way too?
Wow, I love that because it's not like saying every single person has to turn off their location and can't share it with a single person, but
Because
realize
that's not realistic
it's
for
not gonna
young
happen.
people. It's not.
Yeah. I mean, I have my location on with a bunch of people. So like I completely understand, the use too. Like it's like, oh, okay, they're driving. Like I'm not gonna call at this point. Or and I don't want to put them in a situation where they have to answer and they're driving, things like that.
That's what I always say to them too. I'm like, if you have that, I'm like, let's also use this for safety. Like, if you're going to call your friends or send your friend like the fifth text message because they didn't get back to you about something, like, check, make sure they're not driving. And even if they're not driving, if they're in the car with someone, respect maybe they're connecting one on one with that person and they're having a conversation.
Wow.
So I feel like we can just use it for healthy boundaries too.
Yeah, that's wonderful. And then one more thing with the constant texting is the issue with that basically that it removes them from the situation that they might be in, or where does it cross a line where it becomes like about maintaining power and control where they're texting all the time and they expect a response?
I was going to say, I think the expectation of the response, and also there is something about a phone call coming in. You can like hang up that phone call, you can silence your phone, you can ignore it. But a text message is repeatedly coming through unless you block that person.
Mhm.
And it's hard to not be human. And perhaps even if you're in an argument or even if you want space, even if you're not it's hard to like not look at that. So I feel like just this constant influx that you can't really turn off without turning your device off, which again, I think is kind of an unrealistic expectation because our devices are so widely used by all of us, and but specifically young people. So I think the constant texting is really just this influx and this inability to step away from it. I even think about this with friendships and young people, that there's just always this constant connection that, and that can even bring us into social media, but there's just not this natural space and time that occurs between people, either in friendships or relationships. It's just this repetitive and constant access that doesn't really turn off. And I think it's all about that access it gives to the other person, where they then have the control to say, like, maybe their read receipts are on and I know you read that message, or I see you're on Instagram right now, like you're just posting, like, but you're not answering my text, like, hello, you are on your phone. And we should have space to be human and be on our phones in one way and not have to engage with people in another way. Like, I can doom scroll and not answer back your text right now, and that's okay. But I think that becomes a blurry line for people. And in relationships where there is a power and control dynamic, I can absolutely see how a partner could call out the other ways they may be using their phone. Like, I see you on Snap right now. Like, hello, why aren't you answering me? Or I see your location right now. I see you're just at home. You're sitting on the couch. Why aren't you answering me? So just like all these constant access points, I think can lead to this constant texting as well.
And this is a problem that even doesn't end when you're a teen, because this is stuff that I've heard people that are my age saying,
That's
like,
what I was referring to with like the I have the right to doom scroll and not answer your text
yeah,
message.
yeah, it's really interesting though, because I've heard people say, like, oh, their Snapchat score is going up and they're not responding to me, or like, I can tell they were active on Instagram 1 minute ago and like they're not responding to this text, or to your point, they're home. Why aren't they talking to me? And I mean, I think it's obvious to us why that's a problem, but could you break down why it's healthy sometimes to have that space, and why there shouldn't always be an expectation that you're going to respond to your partner?
Oh my gosh, to our partners, to our friends, like to anyone in our life, but everyone deserves space and time to themselves. And we don't have to constantly be talking to any other people in our life. And we're allowed to turn our brain off to other conversation and enjoy whatever we're doing, whether it be schoolwork, work as adults, or like I said, scrolling around on social media, enjoying content you're choosing to take in, reading your book, reading some articles on your phone. And engaging in a hobby, playing video games, whatever takes up your time. It is so important to have that time and space for who you are in all of our relationships from the time they start all the way through our life. I think it's just so important for everyone to have that space and time. And that's what really helps give us our identity and who we are. And it's so important to still be us even when we are in a relationship. And I always try to tell students that I think it's such a great mindset to enter relationships and just start new relationships with promising yourself to maintain all the pieces of your life that make up who you are. And I call it relationship armor, that even in a great and healthy relationship or an unhealthy relationship, regardless of how things are going to end or not end, if you make a promise to yourself to maintain all these other pieces of your life, your friendship, your family relationships, maybe a job, a hobby, a sport, your schoolwork, your work, whatever these pieces of your life are, and they're different for all of us. But if we make a promise to ourselves to continue to maintain and prioritize all those pieces, a partner will always be a piece of our life, but they will not become our whole life. And then, if for whatever reason this relationship is coming to a close, again, healthy or unhealthy, it gives us the space to close that door a little bit easier if we have all of these other things. So that's why I kind of say this relationship armor, because it's kind of this protective armor. If we have all these other pieces of our life and we have these wonderful friend networks and groups of folks and things we love and engage in to do and still turn to, versus being in a healthy or unhealthy relationship with a partner, but being pulled away or choosing to walk away from all of these other pieces. And then if the relationship doesn't work, what do we feel like we have left?
It really makes me think about culturally, to your point. I think there is this constant connection, this constant belief that if you really like kind of care about somebody, you should be with them all the time, you should want to talk to them all the time.
Yes.
I'm curious, with teens or the young people that you've educated, is there a common barrier or an obstacle towards understanding that certain behaviors are abusive? Maybe they're reluctant to believe that some of these things are actually problematic. Have you come across any of that? Because it's been so normalized of this constant connectivity and sharing and Uber access to each other. What have you seen? What are those kind of common obstacles?
I think it is even a much deeper problem than relationships, like this level of connection that we feel to devices and this constant access to people, that it's not giving anyone, it's taking away from that relationship armor that we just talked about. It's taking away from all these other pieces of our lives, because if we're constantly connected to other people through our devices and our partners, it's not going to allow us to fully be part of all these other things that we want to be part of. So if we are hanging out with our friends and the entire time we're spending time with our friends, we are texting our partner or snapping our partner, whatever that kind of engagement is, it's taking away from the other time and spaces that we're part of. We can only be fully present and engage with things to a certain extent. So if a piece of us is always in this other sphere, it's going to take away from all of these other things too. But it's really hard because it's very, very normalized.
Because some of this is kind of normal or it's accepted, for parents or guardians that are watching this, what are
Yeah.
some of the behavioral warning signs of abuse in teen relationships that they can start to pick up on?
So I think some, and kind of the first that I talk about that I think is extremely prevalent in young people's relationships is that isolation that we see that occurs in relationships. So if you were to notice that your child was withdrawing from friends and family or sports or hobbies that they typically have spent a lot of time doing. So like that kind of abnormal shift in their natural connections that they've had before this partner. Again, whether that's a hobby, whether that's a sport or wanting to quit their job or anything that they've invested their time into, that there's like this sudden withdrawal from because maybe it was taking away time from being with their partner, or again withdrawing from their friends and family and just kind of shifting those normal behaviors. Sudden changes in mood, more anxious, nervous, upset, just like a different demeanor and kind of presentation of themselves, always on their phone, but stressed about it. So, not where it feels like a choice, where it's almost like an obligation, or if they feel kind of like jumpy, or they're like checking it in the nervous way and like making sure they're like checking in with that person, making excuses for their partner's behavior, kind of maybe defending or justifying choices or actions from their partner that just kind of don't sit right with your gut. And like I said, really just like losing interest in those activities that they may have once loved. So I think an overall just kind of like withdraw from other things, a change in behavior and how they're using different things and interacting with the world.
Right. So like all of a sudden, let's say they were like really, really into baseball and then they give it up or something like that.
Yeah,
Yeah. And how could you, because sometimes, being a teenager is hard and you go through these,
super.
yeah, yeah, you go through these natural kind of ebbs and flows with moods and kind of being connected or not. And, for a variety of reasons that just happen and are natural. So how can you tell when that behavior might be related to an abusive relationship rather than maybe just a more standard normal teen experience?
I think thinking about a few of the things I just mentioned and looking for like a pattern of behavior in your young adult in your life. So kind of looking at all of these things together where if you notice there's a little bit more stress and anxiousness and they've also left a sport or a hobby, something they've spent time on. And then you sit there and ask yourself, when's the last time they saw their friends? Like how like this what their normal behaviors are, right? Because also every parent listening to this, you know your kiddo best. Like, you know their behaviors, you know their norms. So I think it's really to look at like this deviation of their norm because some of your kids may hang out with their friends like 4 times a week, maybe one, maybe others are 1 time a week or every other week. So I think it's that deviation of their norm. But if you notice that it's off from their typical track and kind of this pattern of behaviors again. So it's like maybe they're no longer spending time with their friends anymore. They have a new partner and you notice they're on their phone a lot and they seem anxious about it. I would kind of look at the three of those things and be like, okay, so this new person came into their life, or maybe not even new, but this relationship is developing. Now they're not spending time with their friends and they seem kind of jumpy when they're looking at their phone. I would like kind of putting together the pattern of these behaviors. So not just looking at one isolated thing like, oh, my kid isn't doing this anymore, but really looking for a pattern.
Right. It's not like all of a sudden they swapped playing their Switch for playing their Xbox. It's like
Totally.
like it's a consistent pattern that's a deviation. And I love that you said that it's unique to each person that's involved
Totally.
because it's a very individual experience. Another thing that I think for, parents, guardians, people in young adults' life, it can be really difficult, maybe even awkward for them to talk about romantic relationships. Do you have any suggestions for how they go about bringing this up? Because some people might be hesitant to even reference it or not know if this will make them uncomfortable or if it will make it worse. So, do you have any tips on how to kind of navigate that?
My biggest tip is to make it a natural conversation. make it frequent and do not make it a lecture. Don't make it seem like you're telling your teen like dating rules or what your expectations for them are. There is nothing more that young people dislike than feeling like they have to follow like a dating rule book by their parents. So, really, just making it a natural conversation. Try to be really casual about it. So, if you are watching a movie with your family and you see an unhealthy relationship portrayal, or even the whole relationship could seem pretty good, but there was like one thing that happened that you were just like, oh, I didn't like that. Say that, talk about it, ask them how they feel about it. I think is a really great way to gauge how your teen is feeling about something or kind of their ideals of relationships, and just be like, what do you think of that? Like, did you like that? And seeing what they say. Maybe they're like, oh, no. Or maybe they're okay with it. Learn a little bit more about what their natural kind of reactions to things are, and to just have these conversations. Or you're in the car and you're listening to music. You let your kid be the DJ and they put on some music, and you kind of are just sitting there driving, noticing some of the lyrics or the songs, and take a moment to be like, whoa, what do you think about that? And really, I think one of the greatest things we can do is make it natural, bring it up casually, but asking them how they feel about it to make them reflect on it versus telling them how you feel about it and what you hate or dislike. You can chime in. Like, if your kid says, like, oh yeah, like this is crazy, and they start telling you something about going on in like pop culture media, and they're telling you about the story that's happening that you may not have known, sit back, let them talk, give them the space to share. But then if they say something like acknowledging that something's like unhealthy or something's crazy, take that moment to chime in and be like, oh my gosh, yeah, like I totally agree with you. Like, validate that gut reaction that they had. But I'd say it's mostly about opening the door for them to reflect on relationships, which is what we really try to do when we're in the classroom space too. I don't go in and tell young people, hey, this is the list of healthy behaviors. This is the list of unhealthy behaviors. If you see this, I want you to avoid this. We talk about relationship topics and behaviors and things that come up, and we encourage young people to think about them. I think my best workshops with students are where I am talking the least and I am asking questions that everyone is raising their hand and responding to one another and engaging in conversation. So I think modeling a similar thing at home, where you want to make them reflect on these kind of relationships in society, books, movies, TV, any explanations we have in front of us. But I think opening the door for your kid to kind of reflect on that and validating when they're getting something right, when they see it, the right, be like, yes, and kind of chime in with them.
Yeah, I think that's wonderful advice because you don't want like somebody to like bring a huge book and be like, and this is how you have to have a healthy relationship. But the
It also looks different for everyone. Like we've kind of talked about, like some people, there's of course some things that are pretty clear if it's controlling or not, but we all do develop our own kind of things that we feel comfortable with and happy in relationships with. So I think it's giving them space to figure that out too.
Yeah, and what is the benefit of that reflection? Is it just kind of building their own knowledge of relationships and like skill set almost around what they think is appropriate, and then maybe the parent could discuss it if what they think is appropriate maybe it might be unhealthy? What is the benefit of that reflection?
I think it's a lot because we don't want to come at young people and lecture them and tell them what to think about this and tell them what to do. There are already so many other spaces, right, where we as young people are like told what to do and how to think and what is right and what is wrong. And hopefully through other things we've learned and how we've learned to be good friends and good people and just all of these great qualities and skills that we have in us to kind of assess different situations, hopefully that reflection can help us kind of challenge norms a little bit, and when asked in a way that we can reflect on it, actually thinking, oh, maybe I'm not okay with this, but I thought I was. And I even had someone come up to me today after class, and they were saying that they thought they were okay with something. And then just kind of the way we were all speaking about it in the large group, they said it made them kind of just reconsider that thought and how they felt about it. And I just thought, that's so cool. And that's kind of the purpose of why we're reflecting on this, because if we don't talk about it, if we're not having conversations, our ideas of what's normal could be just from what we see online, what we're consuming, or what our partner tells us is. But if we talk about it out loud, it can even have us reflect on it a little differently. I know just in general, I've had ideas or thoughts about something. And then once I say it out loud, I'm like, oh, maybe do I feel this way about it? Like it feels different when we kind of say it and think about it. So I just think that whole reflective process allows young people to think about it themselves, but also kind of tap into their gut and what really actually feels good to them. And then maybe they challenge their own thinking in a way too.
Yeah, that's a really good point. So you mentioned this a little bit, but what are some other like common pitfalls that parents or guardians kind of fall into when they are talking about romance and dating to younger people? I mean, you said basically lecturing, like telling them how things have to be, but are there any other things that you've seen that come up that maybe parents should avoid doing or they don't talk to their teens in that way?
I really think about just like the not like lecturing your teen, honestly, like we talked about. I think that's like one of the first things that like come up to me, and like not to say to someone, I would never let someone treat me that way. Like ask questions, let them share their perspective, let them talk to you about how they feel. Because again, we're all humans creating our own kind of expectations and what we feel comfortable with. And boundaries are developed for ourselves and like what we feel safe and comfortable with. And we don't want other people to give us like those boundaries for us. We want young people to come up with them on their own. So I think like the biggest thing that just comes to me is the not normalizing these kind of behaviors, and then also looking at the relationships we're modeling for the young people in our life, and knowing that we are kind of setting a tone and expectation and telling young people in our life that the way I'm maybe going to treat a partner in my life is you're going to see that and you're going to think that's how you can treat a partner too. So, kind of checking our own relationships and behaviors and communications as well. Because if we're sitting here telling a teen that I would never let so and so do this, but when we have arguments, they're completely unhealthy on our end, what kind of modeling is that having for our relationship? So I think that one can be a really tough one. I'm not going to sit here and tell my teen healthy ways to treat one another and then model unhealthy relationships myself.
That's a big one. And I think that that's a really important thing that you bring up, basically, that it's kind of two ways. You know, you have to be mindful of what you're demonstrating as well. That can be hard for people to really reflect on, but also super necessary. And it's
And
interesting.
not just romantic relationships, but modeling in friendships, modeling in relationships, parents with their parents and guardians, or the relationship you have with your child, or that the expectation you have that siblings treat one another. But
Yeah.
that general just relationship norm and setting and expectation of how we treat one another, I think is really important. And when we're in the classroom, we start talking to kids as young as sixth grade. We talk about building healthy friendships because that is the building block of having healthy, intimate partners and relationships one day. And if we know how to be a great friend and to treat people with kindness and all those wonderful respect and great ways that we treat good friends, and we expect friends to treat us, that can be the building blocks for healthy relationships one day in all of our relationships. So I think the modeling healthy relationships is huge.
I love that you keep bringing it back to all relationships because even though, like, obviously we're a domestic violence agency and we try and prevent domestic violence, dating abuse, all that, I remember you saying this to me the first time we talked about this, that you would educate particularly very young kids about the building blocks of friendship and how
Yeah.
that applies to relationships. And why is it so important that you do keep making this distinction and going back to kind of all relationships and not just romantic ones about them being healthy and the significance of that?
Because domestic violence and dating abuse really is about the pattern of unhealthy behaviors to gain and maintain power and control. And power and control dynamics can occur outside of intimate partners. And like you said, here at JBWS, of course, our work is mainly domestic violence and dating abuse and helping people escape that power and control dynamic. But those power and control dynamics we see among friendships and bullying. That is what a bully is. It is someone gaining and maintaining power and control over you in a friendship. So there's those romantic and intimate pieces aside from that. But really, how we build this for young people is that those power and control dynamics that a bully has that is like dating the bully one day. A person causing harm in an unhealthy relationship is using the same power and control dynamics that a bully uses in friendship. So it is so linked.
Wow, that is a really good way to explain it. Another thing that comes to mind about this topic, though, especially as we're addressing thinking about parents and how they talk about relationships and maybe how they think of teen relationships, do you think there's also some level of downplaying the significance of, let's say, a romantic relationship among teenagers that maybe makes them less likely to believe that anything that could possibly be happening between them could be abusive or dangerous? Because it's kind of like, oh, you're so young, like, you won't always be together, whatever. Like, this doesn't really matter. You're 14. Do you
That's literally what I was going to say is that you're so young, you won't even remember this relationship. But the emotional impact is real. Even if the relationship is incredibly short term, again, that is setting that person's like standards and what they think of a relationship. If their first relationship is someone causing harm and using power and control and being unhealthy, what is that person's framework going to be when they go into the next relationship? This is setting our expectations of what we think a partnership and a romantic relationship is. So I think it is so incredibly important to be having these conversations and talking to young people and fostering these healthy relationships, because this is setting, again, to go back to the building blocks, this is setting our expectations. And if young people are in unhealthy relationships and these are being normalized or downplayed or minimized, that's how they're going to feel about it as well. If a person is being really impacted by an unhealthy relationship, and as anyone in their life, we're saying something like, you're so young, like this won't matter one day. Even healthy relationships, like when young people are going through heartbreaks, for the response to be like, you're so young, you won't even remember this, that really downplays how much this moment sucks and
very
how much this moment hurts. And so for it to be about maybe even being hurt, and say a parent was saying that, say it's an unhealthy relationship and your teen got dumped by that partner, and then you're saying that this doesn't matter and you're invalidating this moment in this space, you're saying all of that didn't matter. And to them, and when you are a young person and that age, oh man, you got blinders on. That is all that matters. And it feels so intense and it feels so big. So just for it to be invalidated in any way, shape, or form, healthy or unhealthy, it's really hard.
I would also imagine it would make it difficult for them to then want to open up to their parents again, should something be.
Absolutely.
And you don't want to kind of establish the relationship where you can't talk to them about, your relationships with people. And
Absolutely. You want to keep that door so open. I think that's like one of the main goals, I would think, is keep that door open. You want the young adult in your life to come talk to you about this. You want them to know you're a resource. You want them to feel comfortable to tell you if that partner is treating them badly, and that your immediate reaction isn't going to be what you have to leave them.
right. And I think we should get into that because I think a common response for a parent or guardian, which I do think is natural, right? Like they're used
Oh
to
my gosh, yeah.
right? They're used to protecting their child or whoever they're looking after, and they're thinking, okay, you're in an abusive relationship, leave them immediately, get out of there. They might force the breakup because they think that that's what's best for them or the only possible course of action. Why isn't that correct? And why can that actually be really dangerous?
I can think of, I can so relate to how a parent's immediate reaction would be like, well, I know how to end this. You're not allowed to see them. Problem solved. Like, I just fixed the situation. I can like so resonate with that gut reaction of a parent 1000%, but it can push them closer to the person who is causing harm. It also can make them hide the relationship from you and make them stop talking to you and other friends about it, because they may not be ready to leave. They have to figure out when they're ready to leave. You can help support them on that path and that journey, but they might not be ready to leave. And if you're trying to come in and force that, they could just hide it from you. That could instantly be what they want to do. They're going to withdraw. Then even they may think like, "Oh my gosh, this person who's causing me harm, they're really the only one that gets it. Like they're the only one who's there for me." So we could really be pushing them closer to that person causing harm. So we need to support them. We need to help them seek options, and we need to keep the conversation open.
And it also could be very dangerous. Most dangerous time in someone's life is when they leave an abusive partner. And I think, once again, maybe parents or guardians not fully recognizing the danger might also have to do with believing that teen relationships don't carry the same weight as adult.
Yeah.
And I think that that is just a really, really good reminder in general. And then, obviously we have a lot of services and stuff that can help people with that education.
Mm-hmm.
Before we wrap, is there anything else that you'd like to add about this topic that you think people should know about dating abuse that we didn't already get to?
I think that dating abuse, it can happen to anyone. It can happen to anyone, regardless of gender. It can happen to anyone. And I think that is a huge thing to just really think about. No teen is immune. It can happen to anyone. Anyone can be treated badly by a partner. Anyone's partner can try to gain and maintain power and control over them. And the most powerful thing that we can do is create spaces where young people feel safe to talk. And that's what we really hope to do in the classroom. And that's what I really hope to convey in this conversation, that parents can create these spaces as home as well. But creating the space for young people to have these conversations, to feel comfortable to tell you if maybe there's something happening in their relationship that is a little bit of a gray area, that maybe they're not really sure about how they feel about it. And just be there without judgment. And it can make all the difference to just have and hold that space for young people, encourage them to talk to us. And any young person who's also listening to this, all of your experiences are extremely valid. This can happen to you. This happens to 1 in 3 young people. And just knowing that here at JBWS, we are supports for you. We are here. Our resources are private, they're confidential, they're free. You can reach out at any time. You can ask us any question. There is no silly question. If you listen to this podcast and you think, oh my gosh, I think my best friend is being treated this way, reach out to us, call us. We can talk to you about it. We can help you navigate the resources and how to have this conversation with your friend. But we're just here. Hopefully your parents and guardians are there. I know you have a lot of trusted adults at school too. So just turn to the trusted adults in your life. JBWS is always one of them, and just reach out, have these conversations. We're always here to help you guys.
Thank you, Maddie, for doing such amazing work to prevent domestic violence in our community. I'm always so fascinated by the types of conversations we have about this subject, particularly around the significance of modeling healthy relationships outside of a romantic context. If you are in an unhealthy relationship, resources are linked at the end of this episode and in the show notes. Just as a reminder, this is going to be our last weekly episode. We are moving to a bi-weekly release schedule for the rest of the year, and the next episode will drop on March 11th. Thank you so much for listening. Having these types of conversations is the first step in ending domestic violence. Thank you for listening to this episode of Unsilenced, Real Conversations About Abuse. This podcast is produced by JBWS, a domestic violence agency serving Morris County, New Jersey. Please let us know what topics you would like covered on this podcast by sending an email to podcast@jbws.org. Please note that this email address is only intended for content relating to the podcast. It is not meant to offer immediate assistance or access to services. If you live or work in Morris County and think you might be in an unhealthy relationship, JBWS is here to help. Please visit our website at jbws.org to learn more about our services, or call our 24-hour helpline to speak to members of our staff at 1-877-782-2873. If you recognize controlling or abusive behaviors in yourself, JBWS can also help change those behaviors. Through our Jersey Center for Nonviolence, JBWS offers programs for men, women, and adolescent males who have used abusive or controlling behaviors in their relationships. Please visit jbws.org/JCNV or call 973 539-7801 to learn more. If you don't live in Morris County, please call the National Domestic Violence Hotline at 1-800-799-7233. Domestic violence grows in silence, so thank you so much for listening and helping us break through that silence through these types of conversations. Please follow us on social media and continue to share our content to get as many people talking about domestic abuse as possible.